I'm Inez Stepman,
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
and this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, we've got a great lineup of topics for you this week. First, we're going to discuss, we're going to have Will discussing the case of the pro-Hamas protester with a green card who was just blowing up the internet, right? And questions about free speech, questions about what the rules are for deportation. We're going to go through all of that. And then I'm going to discuss something sort of related, Columbia University losing $400 million in grants. By the way, this is about half of what is usually sent annually to Columbia University in federal grants. And they're losing it on Title VI grounds for failing to stop racial harassment against Jewish students on campus during that last summer batch of protests. And we'll talk about that. And then we'll go ahead and turn to Ben, who's going to talk about the way that conservatives have been fighting back against the Lawfare strategy 2.0. So an update on that. And then finally, we're going to talk about how Democrats are starting to sound awfully like the Republican Party. So Amber's going to take us through their copycat strategy and see if we think that's going to work. So with that, I'll kick it over to Will to kick us off.
Thanks, Inez. A few days ago, a guy named Mahmoud Khalil, who is a graduate student at Columbia, I believe, or maybe not a graduate student anymore, but he's a green card holder in the United States. He was formerly the spokesman for an organization called Columbia University Apartheid Divest and was involved in being a spokesman for the various Palestine encampments that sprung up over the last year. Was detained by ICE agents in New York, and he's told that he was going to lose both his visa and his green card. And he's currently sitting in a detainment facility in Louisiana. There's a lot of, and so it's led to this big debate about whether or not the deportation of this guy is justifiable, whether it's lawful, whether there's a First Amendment violation going on. So having actually read through the statute, there's just a number of independent grounds on which this guy can lose his green card, and it all just involves terrorism stuff. So basically, if you're personally involved in supporting or espousing terrorism, or if you put yourself forward as a representative of an organization that espouses or endorses terrorism, then that makes you an inadmissible alien and deportable, even if you have permanent residency and a green card. And this seems like an eminently reasonable rule because guess what? If you have a green card, you're not a citizen, and that includes all sorts of other things. You owe allegiance to another government until you are a citizen of the United States. You don't get to vote in our elections, but you're also not obligated to serve. You would never be obligated to serve in our military. You wouldn't be draftable. Other countries would have a claim on you and could represent you diplomatically. Like there's all sorts of reasons why non-citizens don't have the same rights as citizens. You're a guest. And this guest has done something that violated the terms of his green card very straightforwardly. Now, people are saying, well, what about the First Amendment? And it's like, well, nobody's saying he committed a crime necessarily. I mean, I think he probably did commit some crimes in New York State that were not prosecuted when he trespassed and when he was involved in this encampment. But that's beside the point. Committing a crime is not the only reason you can lose your green card under American law. You can also support a terrorist organization. And it's not a First Amendment violation. We're not arresting him. We're not arresting him for his First Amendment. We're detaining him because he violated the terms of his visa to be here. He's not going to sit in American jail for 10 years, 15 years for a speech crime. Rather, he's simply going to be deported because he's not a person that the government in its wisdom thinks is wise to be in the country. There's another independent reason he can be deported. The Secretary of State can make a determination that his continued presence threatens American foreign policy. And honestly, there's a very compelling case that it does. There is plenty of evidence that it was the continued prominence of these protests in the United States that led Hamas to be recalcitrant in negotiations to hand over American citizens that it had taken hostage. So that's another independent ground on which this guy's green card can be revoked. So I think it's a very clear situation where it's a good thing that this person's green card can be revoked. There's not a slippery slope because I talked about this with Inez beforehand, but the visa context is completely divorced from the context of American citizens and their speech. And this has no impact on the question of whether or not you can be thrown in jail on the basis of a speech crime or whether the First Amendment protects you. Deportation is a totally different legal context, and it won't be bad. But anyway, I'm curious what you all think. I think this is the only real complaint that one can be made about this is that we aren't deporting enough of these people fast enough.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Will was referencing, I don't think and we were putting our heads together to see if we could come up with any citation on this. But I don't believe there has ever been a case in US law where restrictions in the visa context were carried over or used as a justification for narrowing the rights of American citizens. There's a huge laundry list of restrictions on different types of visas that would be flatly unconstitutional if they were applied to American citizens. Like Will said, the context here is you're a guest. There are certain rules to you being a guest here that do not apply to American citizens. And there are multiple independent grounds where if you violate those restrictions, you're asked to leave the country. And so, yeah, I don't see how there is any problem with this. We'll discuss free speech in the next segment as well. But I do think a lot of this is a lack of understanding of sort of the legal context here. And the Supreme Court has been pretty clear over the years. There's some contrary precedent, but we'll see how it goes. That Congress has plenary power to exclude non-citizens for basically any reason. So that's the context in which this happens. Again, I agree completely with Will. The only problem is that there aren't more of these deportations happening. There's absolutely no reason why somebody who is invited to stay in the United States should be allowed to stay if they are endorsing terrorist groups that America has designated as terrorist groups abroad.
I obviously am one of those people who does not understand much of the legal precedent for this. So I have a question for the lawyers in the group, just because one of the contentions I've been seeing is that if he were on a student visa, this would be more obvious, but because he's a green card holder, the rules are slightly different. Is that something that you all can address?
Sure. So he's a green card holder, which means he's entitled to more due process in terms of his removal. So if he wants to challenge his removal and go in front of an immigration judge, he's entitled to get in front of an immigration judge. I'm not sure student visa holders are entitled to that. I haven't looked into it, but I think there's more robust due process protections. Once you're a permanent citizen, you're entitled to more of a hearing, but you're still not entitled to necessarily go to court and get a district judge to rule on your case. You get an immigration judge. And the second thing is there are more limited grounds on which you can be removed. But terrorism is still, and this espousing, endorsing terrorism is still one of the big areas. I actually saw, it was kind of funny. I saw another tweet from a guy who is a green card holder, just a random guy from New Hampshire. But he was in the replies and he's saying, when I got my green card, I was told you can have your green card revoked if you commit a crime, a serious crime, or if you start supporting or endorsing terrorism. Like, it's one of the things that happens in the process of getting your green card. So this guy would have known exactly what the rules were. And it's surprising that he didn't understand that his activity was putting him at risk of being removed from his, he's got an 8 months pregnant wife. I have no idea what he was thinking. No idea. It's just totally reckless.
Just to add, the due process that Will is referring to, the purpose of that due process is to establish whether or not he did the thing, right? It's not because he has some independent right to be. So in other words, the entire crux of the due process hearing that he probably will receive if he chooses to challenge his deportation order will be, did you or did you not endorse or support terrorism? I mean, the case there is pretty clear, I think, since he did it on video. But that's what the due process hinges on. It's not about him being able to stay. It's just whether or not he did the thing. And yes, I mean, I think that's right. We want a country with due process that establishes whether or not even somebody who is a guest here. We don't want, a sort of arbitrary system where people's visas can be revoked without even regard to the underlying facts of the matter, or having no opportunity to challenge and say, no, I didn't do this, right? But that's what the due process piece is for.
I would just say at a very basic level, the Constitution is a suicide pact if non-citizens have inalienable rights to come here and propagandize on behalf of jihadist groups, call for the violent overthrow of the United States, genociding entire peoples, and of course menacing and threatening, probably committing crimes in the course of obstructing basic life on a campus. And all of that, according to open source materials, this guy has engaged in. And you can be sure that the government has vastly more information than the public is looking at to assess what this person's involvement is in effectively engaging in information operations on behalf of jihadist groups. In terms of the law itself, which is almost secondary from just the basic principle of you don't have a right to come here and advocate for groups that want to destroy us, If you look at the INA, Immigration and Nationality Act, and you look at who's inadmissible, well, lo and behold, people who are parts of totalitarian parties, people who have been associated with terrorist organizations, and intends while in the United States to engage solely, principally, or incidentally in activities that can endanger the welfare, safety, or security of the United States. These are inadmissible categories of people. So I think almost no one is operating in good faith in trying to defend this guy. And I will point out an irony here. This goes for Senate Judiciary Committee Democrats. I think it was the Judiciary Committee. Maybe it was the Democrats writ large, but I think the Judiciary Committee and many of the others who are defending this guy and feigning concern for rights. Many of the people on the left defending him are the same people who were for imposing a mass federal government-led censorship regime against American citizens for clearly protected political speech. But they're up in arms over the fact that non-citizens can't propagandize on behalf of jihadist groups and ought to be kicked out of the country. In terms of the slippery slope argument here, one other point that I would make is, if you assume that when the Democrats are in power, let's say they say that an Israeli who is against the quote unquote two-state solution and advocating against it and for annexation of lands, let's say that a Democrat says that's affiliating with dangerous Israeli parties and those people should be inadmissible. Well, guess what? The slippery slope, the Biden administration already went down that slope. They imposed sanctions on Israelis who dared to oppose the administration's policies with respect to creation of a Palestinian Arab state. They threatened to impose those sanctions on Israel's own elected leaders. So we're already there. If you think that that might be what's coming, we're already there in terms of where the left is. And ultimately, this comes down to who are your representatives and who do they view as our allies and our enemies. I think the notion of slippery slope, don't want to set precedent, et cetera, it's basically gone in our system. Democrats eviscerated it, and these are the new stakes. But again, I go back to the basic point of if you want to survive as a country, you don't invite people in who want to destroy your country and advocate on behalf of your adversaries, for whom psychological operations, information warfare is a key tactic they engage in and a key part of their overall grand strategy. Last point I'll make is I do wonder if social media is amplifying the voices who are on the Mahmoud Khalil side on this, because I have to believe that this is something that's like a 90-10 issue or an 80-20 issue at worst among Americans. But the left is obviously very good at organizing and propagandizing. And so I wonder if they are louder than they are large in terms of who is actually on this guy's side against the administration.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here except, outside of the legal ramifications here, which have been well discussed. I think, I've been an advocate for being even more judicious and stringent on the type of people that we accept into the United States to get visas and green cards, because traditionally our vetting system has been incredibly broken, where we don't ask basic questions or really look deeper into ideology as a factor when deciding who to admit into the United States. And this guy seems like an obvious test case for that question.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Amber that the question is not, should this guy be deported? The question is, why is this guy in the United States, and why are so many people
Right.
obviously support the enemies of the United States being invited into the country, right? But with that, we're going to go ahead and transition to the next segment, which is related in a certain sense. It's continuing ramifications from those protests from last summer at Columbia and other universities. So the Trump administration is withholding $400 million in grants. Again, that's about half of what we give generally annually to Columbia in grants alone, and I'll get to this. But in grants alone, so the Trump administration is withholding half of Columbia's grants, which will make a serious dent in their budget. They are dependent on these grants. And the grounds on which they're withholding those funds are Title VI grounds. So the Civil Rights Act has multiple titles. Many of you've heard of Title IX, right? Some of us have heard of Title VII in the employment context. This is Title VI. So this is applying to educational institutions. And the standard there is basically that there are certain types of behavior and action. I'm choosing my words really carefully here because speech alone is not enough. but certain types of actions that students can take against one another on a university campus, where the university has an obligation to step in. And generally speaking, that's the threshold where a student is being harassed on the basis of race, religion, national origin, to a point where that's affecting his or her ability to take advantage of the education that he or she is paying for, right? So in this case, I want to be super clear. It is completely constitutionally protected in the United States, especially on a public university, but in most cases in private universities as well, because these are their speech codes and stuff that you sign on to as a student. It's completely fine to stand in the quad and scream that you hate Jews. Like that is a First Amendment protected activity in the United States. What's not protected and what may result in a school losing their funding is that the school has an obligation to prevent racially based harassment. So that has to come with an action. In this case, like following around Jewish students from class to class, screaming epithets at them, or preventing Jewish students from crossing the campus in order to get to their classes. So those are the kind of actions that go along with speech that then qualify for Title VI. So I think this is long overdue. I've advocated that funds be pulled from universities on a whole variety of grounds, this being one of them. I think there are ample other grounds to pull funds from universities, starting with the fact that basically every university is an open rebellion against the SFFA case in terms of admission and race-based admissions practices. Almost every school is practicing racially discriminatory admissions. So that's another reason for the Trump administration to pull funds. I'm sure they are working on that as well. There are additional reasons to pull funds that have to do, just like I just mentioned, Title VII. The university is an employer. They're not allowed to discriminate as an employer, just like they're not allowed to now discriminate in admissions. So, hiring a whole department, for example, on the basis of quote unquote diversity is potentially illegal behavior. It is illegal behavior. It has been illegal behavior. It's never been legal to do that under Title VII employment law, and yet we've just had administration after administration that has turned the other way. So universities fundamentally accept a lot of money. This is only grants. They're even more dependent on student loan funds, which is the Title IV funds that basically, again, every university, but basically Hillsdale, is completely dependent on subsidized student loans. So universities are incredibly vulnerable on this. This is just one of many grounds in which they can lose. I think this one was kind of the simplest and the easiest to kind of work through the administrative process on, but I would expect this to keep coming. I would expect on a variety of grounds, a lot of these grants to start being pulled, which I think is unequivocally a great thing. I don't know what the rest of you guys think about this.
So one thing that's notable also up front is that I think that the total outstanding potential grants to Columbia were something like $5 billion. So this is still a fraction, and we're talking $5 billion in a single institution. So you can imagine how significant this sort of policy would be to the extent it's pursued at all the schools that have conducted themselves like Columbia. Full disclosure, by the way, I'm a Columbia alum. 20 years ago, the campus looked exactly the same. There was Israeli Apartheid Week every single year. The Middle East Studies Department has been a hotbed of pro-jihadist activity since time immemorial. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was invited to come speak while I was a student at Columbia. So there's a long history of this beyond all the other, obviously radical progressivism that the school has promoted for decades. And I would again say at a basic level, just like in the last segment, that you've no inalienable right to come to our campuses and comport yourself like Khalil. Why should we be underwriting campuses that are hotbeds of anti-Americanism that call for the destruction of Western civilization when those campuses are a very product of Western civilization? And by the way, at Columbia, there's a core curriculum where you have to read all of the Western canon. And you're going to invite people there or underwrite a school that then essentially protects as a class those who want to destroy that civilization. It's just utterly asinine. So I think this move was probably an initial shot across the bow. We've seen that Harvard has indicated that they're going to impose, it seems like, some kind of hiring freeze, that they're concerned about the potential monetary consequences of the radicalism they've allowed to fester. And the last point that I would make is the schools themselves are essentially engaging in or helping those conspiring to deprive the rights of other students to operate. It's not about speech, it's about action ultimately by not maintaining law and order on campuses. Conspiracy to deprive rights is exactly what the Justice Department went after Donald Trump over with respect to January 6th. Turnabout's fair play, and you could very easily see statutes just like that, and any creative or even not creative lawyer can probably figure out a way to turn it on these schools. Final point is just the foreign funding of universities is the next Rubicon that ought to be crossed. I think that truly mandating disclosure and transparency with respect to the foreign funding of schools alone might deter the foreign funders, that oftentimes you can link that foreign funding and to the underwriting of the very radical activities and the passive response, to say the least, from the administrators and enforcement officers on these campuses. That's something that Congress ought to be focused like a laser on as well.
Yeah, I mean, Confucius Institutes during the first Trump admin, schools that had those were going to be stripped of federal funding under Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Biden reinstituted federal funding for schools that had Confucius Institutes, which are backed by the CCP. And I have not seen anything from the second admin on what they're doing about that issue, but you would think that and other sources of foreign funding, like Qatar's a big one in American universities, which should be a target for this admin if they're going to use the federal purse as a way of instituting some kind of pressure on these institutions. And it is quite wild to watch the left, which has been at the forefront of a massive censorship regime, now try to conflate speech with actions that are actually violating the law, whether it's through the illegal encampments, the trespassing of school buildings, preventing the freedom of movement, equating that with speech after being the people who are trying to shout down conservative speakers, advocating for the Biden administration's attempts to tamp down misinformation on social media, shows just how bad faith these people are acting in.
Yeah, I just, taking back to like the original topic, I think I'm thrilled. Like we should, I'm confused by, I'm not confused. I'm saddened that I didn't think of stopping their grants before I thought of seizing the endowments. That's what I'm frustrated by. Like, I think that I didn't think about how effective a weapon it would be to stop these grants, how core they are to the continued funding and operation of the university, and how turning off the tap can create this massive, uproar and upheaval among the faculty of the university to force the institution to change. Because you keep this up, all those faculty are going to move to different universities, and these aren't necessarily the political faculty. These are like the science and the math and the physics and all the hard stuff that you get federal grants for. But I think it's a great idea to say, look, if you want to be attached to an institution that behaves this way, you don't get any federal funding for your research. Go somewhere else. And I think that's a really good way for the federal government to drive the sort of behavior we want out of these universities and make them take their obligations to their students seriously.
Just to slap some numbers on that, it's about $50 billion a year in grants annually to the university system. Like I said, Columbia's grants tend to be between $800 and $900 million every single year. This is just for research, and then, like I said, they're completely dependent on the student loan fund. So that's another huge part of their budget. Every time a student takes out one of these federally backed loans, that's money that they could not have gotten, in many cases from a bank. And so that also comes with strings attached to it. But a lot of these grants are, I think this is one of those things, just like with USAID. Once people start to hear what a lot of these grants are for, because people immediately think science, cancer funding. No, we're talking about $700,000 a UPenn to study how to allocate COVID vaccines on the basis of race. Okay. And there's also just huge overhead in these grants. So it used to be that Congress capped, overhead costs, indirect costs of the research. It used to be capped at 8%. Now it's 60%. So you can request 60% more money on top of what you say the research costs for quote unquote overhead costs, right? For administrative costs. I mean, it is a giant slush fund. And like every one of these bureaucratic giant slush funds, it's been going to leftist causes for many, many decades. So this is a welcome move, and I think there's a lot more to come and a lot more to discover where that's at. But we're going to go ahead and move on to the next subject, which is to talk about Lawfare 2.0 and how conservatives are fighting back.
So I think last week we might have talked a little bit about this decision out of the DC District Court where Judge Amir Ali issued a non-appealable temporary restraining order, a universal injunction that unfroze the Trump administration's pause on foreign aid assistance and required that it pay out allegedly owed funds of an estimated $2 billion to everyone impacted by that order, not just the plaintiffs that were party to the case. And this has sort of become representative of the 100+ cases that have been lodged against the Trump administration seeking to stymie and thwart some of its most fundamental and core executive actions. And there have been any number of zany rulings associated with it. And in this case, the Supreme Court basically refused to step in and overturn that restraining order, went back to the judge and said, you got to give more detail, and it has to be something that the government can comply with, essentially. And that's still being adjudicated, and there's going to be a push for a preliminary injunction there, then that'll get appealed, and the lawyers here can talk about how this ultimately ends up at the Supreme Court probably again. But in the wake of the way in which Democrat attorneys general and activist groups and organizations have judge shopped and forum shopped to take these cases and seek out universal injunctions, there are those who think, and I count myself among them, that while the Supreme Court lets cases ripen and takes its time, the judiciary is rotting. And there has to be a question of how much what the tolerance is of SCOTUS, and if the cost of that tolerance is such that there needs to be more immediate action taken. Universal injunctions where a court prohibits, in this case, the federal government from continuing an activity, not just that supposedly harms one group, but prohibits it against everyone, everywhere, is something that's been heavily debated for a long time. It's a relatively new phenomenon in the law, again, as the lawyers can speak to. And Supreme Court, several justices, namely Justice Thomas and Gorsuch, have called for the court to take up the question of their legality. The court hasn't. In fact, the Biden administration, which only got hit with 14+ universal injunctions, versus Trump 1, which was hit with over 60 universal injunctions, more than half of all issued over the last 60 years. Even the Biden administration asked the Supreme Court to rule on their lawfulness and endorse the views of Thomas and Gorsuch. But while the court dithers and takes its time on this issue, the very day that the Supreme Court failed to overturn Judge Ali's temporary restraining order, in Congress, there was activity to take on and curtail universal injunctions. So Congressman Darrell Issa brought a bill before the House Judiciary Committee to bar universal injunctions, with the exception of when multiple states call for a freeze on a policy, then calling for that to go before a 3-judge panel, and probably likely for there to then be expedited action from the Supreme Court after on appeal. And that passed through the House Judiciary Committee. And at the same time, in the Senate, Chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Chuck Grassley, expressed his disgust with the universal injunctions, the way they're being used against the administration. And he said that basically the Senate needs to consider ways to curtail this as well. Mike Lee has been working on legislation there similar to ISA's, which will probably be introduced sometime in the near future. So the legislative branch is considering acting on this issue. It's really important. To the extent they actually do curtail universal injunctions and preempt the courts, or maybe force the Supreme Court to act more quickly, that would obviously be a major achievement that would curtail a lot of this behavior. Beyond that, there's also potentially legislation coming to bar judge shopping or forum shopping, where plaintiffs try and take cases to districts that are going to be favorable to them and try to get a universal injunction where you only need one out of around 700 federal judges to agree with you. Whereas if you're the administration, you have to be able to win in every single court. There's an asymmetry baked into it. Beyond that, there's some in Congress who are calling for impeachment. There have been articles of impeachment filed against Judge Ali, a couple other judges as well. Some conservative members of the House have set up a judicial activism accountability task force where they're going to try and expose the records of radical judges and push for their impeachment. And then there's also via the Article 3 project, which Will is affiliated with, there's been a push for a couple other remedies, like, for example, potentially taking the $2 billion I mentioned out of the federal judiciary's 2025 budget. So using the power of the purse to fight back against radicalism, potentially limiting the jurisdiction of some of the more radical districts, like the DC district, for example. And then last but not least, the Trump administration itself issued a memorandum, again, right around the same time that this dissent came down from Justice Alito against Judge Ali's order, where the administration is going to advocate that in all cases where temporary restraining orders or injunctions are sought against them, agencies are going to demand that the plaintiffs put up injunction bonds, with the idea being that this will deter frivolous cases from being bought, and it's a way to sort of neutralize judges who would otherwise be apt to impose universal injunctions, because the litigants themselves are going to have the risk of potentially having to put up massive sums of money to the extent they lose in these cases. So with all that said, curious what you make of the pushback. Do you think this is noise, or do you think there's actually teeth here? Or do you think the Supreme Court is going to act and it's going to put a pin in these otherwise, I think, critical efforts to try and combat an out-of-control judiciary?
I would not prejudge what the Supreme Court is going to do here for a few reasons. One, Amy Coney Barrett is apparently like a huge hater of the emergency docket and a huge stickler for the order of like the procedural order of a lot of this stuff. So I would not necessarily assume how she's going to rule on the merits based on some of those disappointing procedural decisions for the right. I'm not saying that she's going to be on our team. I'm just saying wait and see, because I don't think you can make a really good estimate of how she's going to rule on the merits based on some of these procedural sort of like docket issues, essentially in the order of appeal. Second, I want to underline how crazy that Judge Ali's order actually is. Only a tiny fraction of the money that was basically unfrozen has to do with the parties in the case, right? So this is an injunction that goes well beyond, even if he wanted to put in this injunction for the parties to the case that's actually before him. So it's not just a matter of a nationwide injunction from a single radical judge, which is the issue brought up by Alito in his dissent and so on. But like, and we've discussed here too, this one is going particularly far because it's going beyond the parties of the case, right? So the judge is not only putting this kind of nationwide injunction, he is making it the TRO part of it makes it very difficult and impossible to appeal. Right now, they're talking about putting it in place in a more permanent way. So what the Supreme Court basically told the judge was, you better come up with something better than this. Like that was the vibe that I got from reading the Supreme Court order. It's kicking it back to the judge saying, this is really, really broad, and you might want to reconsider the grounds on which you're doing this. Like, for example, it might be justifiable if you're only talking about payments that have payments for contracts that have already been completed, right? And you're talking about the parties in the case in front of you instead of all of the money beyond the parties in the case in front of you, and not giving the Trump administration any leeway between contractually obligated payments, which I can see the argument for. Like if the government signed under Biden a contract with a contract, like a private entity, right, and that work has been fulfilled, then I think there's a strong argument that that money actually probably does need to be paid to those contractors if it's the work has already been completed. But there's no distinction in this case and this order. It's all of the money. It's not just the money that was previously contracted. It's all of the money, and it's nationwide. It's just like very, very broad. So I would my whole posture on this is wait and see. I do think that we're going to have, as we've mentioned multiple times in the last few weeks, we're going to have some really big rulings from the Supreme Court on the constitutionality of essentially agency action, the constitutionality of writing laws with such broad deference to executive agencies, and whether or not Trump can use that broad deference to execute his own ends as opposed to the ends of the bureaucratic state that have been executed in this way for decades. So I think there's probably a lot of big issues before the court, but I wouldn't prejudge based on preliminary or procedural sort of back and forth.
Just one point to add to the lunacy briefly is that we have a court, the Federal Court of Claims, that deals with contract disputes like these. So that's another thing. The judge may not even have jurisdiction here.
Yeah, I tend to agree that we need to wait and see what the Supreme Court does. In terms of the congressional groups that they're creating, I think those are probably pretty toothless and more meant to apply some kind of public pressure, make it look like Republicans are doing something, but ultimately this will be in the hands of SCOTUS.
Yeah, I mean, a lot I could say here. You were right on that final point. In particular, this judge never had jurisdiction, in my view, because it was an issue for the Federal Court of Claims. I think he's about to lose on jurisdiction at the DC Circuit. I think in some ways people have overreacted a little to like the Supreme Court's ruling, which they said it wasn't going to enjoin the district court judge, but in effect forced him to change his ruling up a little bit. That said, I think the big fix that the Supreme Court doesn't get is that it's acting restrained when lower courts are completely out of pocket, and that needs to be fixed. Lower courts themselves need to start acting with judicial restraint. And if they don't, the proper way to think about judicial restraint for the Supreme Court is to put a stop to what the lower courts are doing.
Okay, so with that, we're going to turn to Amber to talk about how some of the things that Democrats are saying seem a little bit suspiciously familiar.
Yeah, it's there's a story that came out from the Daily Caller, actually. My colleague Mary Rook wrote about this interesting trend that she's been noticing among Democrats and how they're messaging the girls' sports issue, meaning transgenders competing in women's sports. And they're trying to take a page out of the Republican playbook on abortion. Obviously, when Trump ran in this past election, his posture on abortion was, now that Roe is overturned, we're going to leave it to the states. I'm not going to pass any kind of federal ban on abortion. If a bill comes to my desk, I'm going to veto it. And pro-life activists are going to have to work at the state level to try to enshrine greater restrictions if that's what they choose. And then pro-choice groups are obviously free to try to fight back. And the Democrats have now decided that that's the exact posture that they want to take on transgender participation in women's sports after Trump's executive order banning the practice. We've heard from people like Alyssa Slotkin and Gavin Newsom that they effectively think that this issue should be closer to the people. And there's a couple of obvious reasons why this strategy does not work on the transgender participation in women's sports issue the way it did on the abortion issue. Abortion is a very divided issue in terms of public polling. Most people support some reasonable restrictions on abortion. There's people on the margins on both extremes who want full bans on abortion versus full unfettered access. But most people land kind of somewhere in the middle. And on the state level, once you get down even more granular, there's a lot of interesting distinctions in terms of what week is the right week to ban abortion, what exceptions should be allowed. And obviously, a place like Texas is going to look a lot different than a place like California. But when you're looking at public polling on the women's sports issue, Trump has landed on the 80% support side of an 80-20 issue, which is that 80% of people do not think that it's right for biological men to participate in women's sports. And this is not also just a women's issue, the way that the left has framed abortion. They are trying to now reframe the sports issue as a women's issue similar to abortion, but this is something that affects moms, dads, the participants in the sports, male athletes, potentially, if there becomes an open category or if sports end up becoming totally integrated in some sort of backlash reaction to the idea that only women's sports are the ones being invaded. And so it's very fascinating to watch them try to take this argument and sort of manipulate it in terms of federalism in regards to women's sports. Plus, on the federal level, you're looking at in high schools and colleges, public schools that are federally funded, right? So that's sort of the crux here, which is that Trump's executive order is effectively banning it by saying that we're no longer going to provide federal funds to schools that allow transgender athletes to participate in women's sports. So it's no longer a state issue at that point if you're talking about federal funding. So you can't just say, well, Maine which is a recent high-profile case because they directly defied what Trump was asking by allowing a transgender athlete to win a competition in a girls' track and field event in Maine. Maine's free to do that, but they're not going to receive federal funding anymore, is what Trump's executive order said. So that's not just a state by state issue from the Democrats' argument, but also to get into a little bit of some of their other strategy outside of this specific issue. We also see them, I think, trying to take a new tone recently, which almost seems in direct response, in my opinion, and I'm curious what you guys think, to Republicans and conservatives taking on independent podcast circuits, capturing a lot of the comic space in terms of Trump doing podcasts with comedians and comedians coming out in that Madison Square Garden rally that caused a lot of headlines ahead of the election. And according to a report from Politico, Democrats are now doubling down, I guess you could say, on using salty language. They've been swearing a lot, cursing a lot, and it's been happening enough that news outlets are noticing this. And it's almost like they're trying to seem relatable or authentic, or trying to come across with this level of bravado or machismo that they view as resonating with voters from the Trump administration and from conservatives. But it ends up coming across as exactly the opposite. A lot of these viral moments where Democrats are angrily cursing are pre-scripted comments, or it's from people who don't curse normally. And it just seems really weird and like they're trying way too hard. And then you couple that with the fact that they fail to understand the right's memeing of JD Vance. There was an article from a left-wing news outlet. I quote tweeted the other day. I can't remember which one. Maybe one of y'all remember what it was, but they were like, we are trying to dig in to understand why the right of all people is making fun of JD Vance. And it's actually, it was The Atlantic, actually. I was just given a reminder, but they're trying to figure out why the right is making fun of JD Vance. And it's like, well, it's not that they're making fun of him per se, but they're ribbing him a little bit, and he's in on the joke. It's sort of friendly teasing among compatriots. And I'm sure some of y'all have seen the memes of like the sort of bloated JD face, and he's supposed to be like the annoying little brother. And then they're just photoshopping JD Vance's face on all of these different sort of historical moments and various memes and making a joke out of it. And Vance has responded to this and said that he finds it all quite funny. And to not understand the sort of locker room talk, for lack of a better analogy, that happens among friends, and the sense of humor that comes along with that is indicative of the left's just inability to be normal and relate to the average American voter. And so you see them grabbing this states' rights argument on the women's sports issue, which again is not a states' rights issue because Trump is talking about federal funding. And then the lack of sense of humor, the inability to laugh at themselves, the uber seriousness with which they're throwing out these curse words about the Trump administration. They are doing this soul searching thing entirely the wrong way, because ultimately what I've been saying for the past few weeks, as we've read all of these think pieces about the left supposedly trying to change their messaging ahead of the next election, is that it's not really the messaging that's the problem, it's the policies. And if you don't change the underlying policies, then the message is not going to resonate, no matter how much you manipulate the language or spice it up in a pretty package with a bow and try to make it sound appealing to people. The underlying meat of the message is the problem. So I'm curious what you all think in terms of this latest Democratic strategy. Is it going to be effective? What else are they missing? And is there really anything they can do short of a full overhaul of the DNC platform that is going to make them more appealing?
I mean, I think fundamentally they're trapped, right? Because as you say, it's not the message. I generally am sort of skeptical. I'm not saying that messaging doesn't matter. Obviously it does, and PR matters, but I feel like 8 out of 10, at least, times that I hear the phrase like, oh, we need to tweak our messaging, it's usually there's an underlying substantive problem. And I feel like it's kind of almost condescending towards the American people to think like, oh, if we just, sort of spin this differently. I'm not saying there's no difference between like making your point well, in a way that people resonate with and not. Obviously that is important, but I feel like it's the catch-all excuse. I feel like I heard that a lot from the right too. Like, oh, we just need better messaging. We just need better messaging. Well, actually it was the stuff that was underlying the messaging that needed to change. So I feel like it's a common Beltway excuse. Oh, we need to tweak our messaging. But one, I wouldn't underestimate just Gavin Newsom's ability to lie with a totally straight face. It actually is a little bit scary. Most people, including politicians, obviously there's plenty of lying going on in politics, but usually it's like, there's sort of plausible deniability. People wriggle around things that are easily checkable. Gavin Newsom will just look the camera straight in the eye and like say one thing, and then 3 hours later say the exact opposite thing. And he kind of agrees with everybody that he talks to. So that's his. I mean, I noticed this in the debate with Ron DeSantis, whatever it was, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. He will just straight up look into the camera and lie. It's kind of an amazing ability on his part. So I wouldn't underestimate that ability in politics. But generally speaking, on this women's sports issue, they cannot get out from under their activist class, because no matter what they say in terms of moderating, every single Democratic senator voted against a bill to exclude men from women's sports. And I think underlying this issue, again, is not just messaging. It's a matter of truth. And I think that's why the other strategy they've tried is downplaying the issue and saying, oh, well, who cares? We're talking about, a handful of people across the country who are competing, a handful of men in women's sports. Well, first of all, every single one of those men competes against hundreds, maybe even thousands of girls, right? So it's not just the one person, it's every person that man then competes with and potentially puts in harm's way, as we saw with one of Trump's invitees for his State of the Union address, Peyton McNabb, who was seriously injured playing a man in volleyball. But it's not even just about the sports. It's obviously a broader issue about truth, right? There's an issue with forcing down people's throats something that they see right in front of them is a lie, which is that it's a fair competition if you put a man in a women's sports team. And so I think that's why that issue is actually important. I know even some people on the right just are like, oh, well, this is a minor issue. This is only economics are real, right? Culture war issues are shiny objects dangled by billionaires or whatever it is to make the working classes fight against each other. No, like I think people rightly sense this is an issue of truth, that you can't be trusted to name something so obvious in front of you. You can't be trusted across the board.
Yeah, I'll be extremely quick here. I think that, in general, like the left is flailing around. They don't have a like default leader. And I think one of the things people need to be aware of is like Gavin Newsom's actually trying really hard to be that guy, because he's started a podcast. He brought on Charlie Kirk. He's brought on Michael Savage. Maybe he's the one guy who realizes like we need to be able to compete in long form podcasting and adversarial long form podcasting. And if I'm worried about anybody, because he has no moral compass. Like the guy will literally advocate anything, flip on a dime. He'll turn the Democrat Party. He just has no fixed principles. So I think that's the guy we really got to be worried about.
I think it's an existential imperative for Democratic Party to have no fixed principles and do a total about face, like Newsom is trying to at least portray that he's doing. But the problem is their ideology will not allow them to do it. So they're in a really challenged place right now between politics and the merits, and also trying to make a clean break from the core basis of everything that they've tried to pursue for several decades now in office.
And with that, we'll go to final thoughts, and I'll take the moderator's prerogative to go first to avoid the Mexican standoff that sometimes occurs. Obviously, one of the big items in the news this week is potentially trade wars. The stock market is responding to the potential Trump tariffs being placed not only on countries like China, but also, allies like Canada. Canadians are very bad about it. There's sort of all this brouhaha around, and I'm not an expert in sort of economic theory or tariffs versus free trade in the specifics, but I wanted to make a sort of 10,000 foot remark on it, which is consistently, and I think this applies to Trump's EO on shipbuilding as well, which is overlooked and I think something that is definitely worth praising. I think Trump is trying to wrench the U.S. economy away from essentially the more cheap goods consumerist model that it has been on for the last 3 decades or even more, but especially the last 3 decades. And it's going to be chaotic and difficult to do that. But ultimately, I think it's a project that is worth pursuing, or at least trying, because it's clear to me that the status quo of the United States being unable to manufacture basic things, even basic military like necessities, to me, this is not a situation that is at all either desirable or even safe for the United States. You would think that during the pandemic, realizing that we can't manufacture and we're like reliant on China and India for basic medical supplies would be a wake-up call. So I think that it is a positive thing to try to do this, to bring some level of manufacturing capability and capacity back home. I think it's imperative for national security that we do so. Right now, we are sleepwalking into a potential great powers warfare in which we have a tiny fraction of the manufacturing capability. Like, we are the opposite side of the World War II dichotomy right now. The U.S. in large part won World War II by being able to out-manufacture everybody. We're now on the opposite side of that with China, where we have virtually no capacity to build ships or anything else. And I'm not just talking about we're not building it now, where we could just like throw some money at the problem, but we don't have the capacity. We don't have the knowledge. Like, our workforce doesn't have the knowledge. We don't have the factories. We don't have the like domestic capability and production that can be repurposed in an event of warfare. Like, we are in a very, very serious situation. And so I don't know exactly like whether, a 25% tariff against Canada is the right call. I will pretend to know that, but I'm definitely willing to give Trump more than a month and a half and some leeway for chaos and potentially economic pain, because I don't see another way to try to right what is a very, very scary long-term trend that, to me, obviously the status quo and the trajectory is not an acceptable one. So I don't know. I just give him a lot of leeway, maybe in 6 months. So you meet back here and like we can say whether this worked or it didn't. But I just think sort of criticizing him for it on the short term and freaking out about it, about the stock market, fluctuations and stuff like that. I don't think that's I think that's missing the forest for the trees here. I do think there's going to be some chaos and pain short term, but ultimately this is a goal worth pursuing.
I completely agree with all of that, Inez. My final thoughts are just an update on the release of the Epstein files. It's been 7 days since Attorney General Pam Bondi said that the Southern District of New York turned over a truckload, as she described it, of documents related to the Epstein case to the FBI, and we have not learned anything further about when the planned release of those is and if and what is going to be released. The first document dump was obviously hugely disappointing. A lot of it was already public information through media reporting, through those binders that were given to conservative influencers, which some suggest was to put pressure on the Southern District of New York to turn over the additional files. But I think we probably agree was not rolled out in a very effective manner. So we're planning on asking the White House about this during a briefing today at time of recording on Tuesday, and hoping to get some more answers on when exactly those are coming out, if they're coming out. It seems odd to me that it's been a full week and we haven't heard anything additional about what she's planning to do with those, what kind of redactions we're going to see, are we going to get the client list, et cetera. And the longer, obviously, this drags on, the more it gives the impression that this is not being done transparently. So I just wanted to give an update on that and say that we're following up on this and trying to get as much information as from the administration as we can, because this has been a political football for too long. It's been covered up for too long, and the American people deserve to know.
So briefly on the issue of protectionism and tariffs, totally agree. And I think this is one of the virtues of the lame duck Trump 2 administration, which is that there's an opportunity to be taking a much longer term posture towards questions like this. And the bottom line is that the waiting is, Do you care more about perceived near-term economic interests or the viability of America over the long term and the ability to be an independent and self-sufficient country, which is a precondition, of course, for being a free country? If you lay it out like that, that obviously, that's not going to provide comfort necessarily to someone in the here and now reacting to market volatility and short-term price increases potentially that we might have to grapple with. But the bottom line is that over the long term, there's no other alternative if we want to be a free nation. So I think these are imperative policies that are being pursued. One positive note, going back to the lawfare side of things, there was a case that I think we might have discussed previously where the director of the Office of Special Counsel, a so-called independent agency, lower courts reinstated his position after the Trump administration fired him. These agencies are quote unquote independent because you can't just fire their leaders at will. According to statutes, you have to fire them for cause on specific grounds. Dellinger challenged this. Usually in the past, courts will deal with things like you'll litigate over back pay allegedly owed someone who was improperly fired, but not reinstating him. He was actually reinstated and going rogue essentially at the Office of Special Counsel, trying to undermine the Trump administration's policies. As that case was litigated, ultimately Dellinger dropped his case. He is out of office. He tried to get the courts essentially not to issue a ruling. The courts did issue a ruling explaining their rationale. Why did he not want the courts to issue a ruling? Because he is afraid, and really the administrative state is afraid, that the Supreme Court is ultimately going to invalidate so-called independent agencies and make it so that, of course, subordinates to the president working in the executive branch or in federal agencies can be fired for any reason and at any time whatsoever. So we're getting closer and closer to the execution, I believe, of the precedent under which Dellinger and others have sought protection, Humphrey's executor.
Yeah, my final thought is on what's going on in Britain with the Reform Party. There's real shenanigans happening where I think Nigel Farage is going hard after Rupert Lowe, who's one of his only few MPs. And Rupert has been very active on Twitter and on X, rather, in a very effective right-wing voice in Britain. And for some reason, they're accusing him of, misconduct, which seems to have disproven on his own based on what I'm reading on Twitter. I just want to say this. I think it's absolutely crazy that the Reform Party is engaging in this infighting when it's on the verge of taking power. They all need to sit down and get along. Crazy that they've let it come to this. And I think, everybody needs to just take an ego check, especially Nigel in this instance. Like, I'm sorry, he's, picking a fight with your most right-wing person and the person who's most consistent on issues like immigration that animate a huge chunk of his base is just a terrible political strategy. So I really hope they get it together because I'd like to see Britain become great again.
And on that note, on behalf of Ben, Amber, and Will, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.